The Galactic Empire moved like a tidal wave across the stars, sweeping up planets and civilizations that dared resist their rule. They didn't care about borders or sovereignty. They cared only about control and expansion. In their eyes, humanity was just another species to be harvested and molded into their vision of perfection, no different from the countless others they had conquered in their wake. And now they had come for the humans of planet Earth. Without warning or mercy, they descended with the might of 1,000 warships and legions of soldiers. Their target was clear: the children of Earth. At first, no one knew why the Empire had chosen Earth. No one knew what made these particular humans so valuable. All anyone knew was that they arrived one day and took without hesitation the young ones, the most vulnerable, the ones who were still too innocent to understand the cruelty of the universe. They came with advanced tech that could disable entire cities. And in a blink, they had the children they wanted loaded onto ships bound for unknown destinations. Red Carter was among those who didn't even know what was happening at first. She had been at home with her daughter Evie, playing in the garden on a bright spring afternoon. The air was warm, and the scent of fresh grass filled the air. They were safe. The world was still their own. Everything was fine until it wasn't. The first signs came as dark ships appeared overhead, blotting out the sun, casting an unnatural shadow across the earth. Nothing like anything they had ever seen before. These ships didn't belong to any known faction. These were sleek, monstrous vessels, gleaming with alien technology, ships that didn't belong in this galaxy at all. And before anyone could react, the ships began to descend with precision. Evie had been laughing in the yard when the ground began to shake. She looked up, eyes wide, at the strange sky. While Red's instincts kicked in, without thinking, she grabbed Evie, pulling her close, covering her with her body as blasts from the ship's weapons rained down on their home. Panic spread like wildfire across the planet as millions watched in horror as the Empire's forces swarmed over their cities. Red didn't have time to think. She grabbed Evie by the hand and ran as the world fell apart behind them. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The Empire was known, but no one thought they would come here. No one thought they would descend on Earth like a plague. But they had, and now there was no turning back. The streets were chaos. People were running, screaming, hiding. But Red knew she had to get Evie out of there. They couldn't afford to be caught. They couldn't afford to be seen by the soldiers, or worse, the drones that patrolled the air, looking for any signs of resistance. She pushed forward, her heart racing, as the sounds of explosions and the screams of the captured children filled the air. She knew who they were taking. They had no interest in adults. They were taking the children of Earth, the innocent souls who had no part in this war, who hadn't even had the chance to grow into their potential. They were being stolen without mercy, and Red was not going to let that happen to her daughter, not to Evie. Just as they reached the outskirts of town, a loud noise broke through the chaos. A giant ship appeared overhead, as if it had materialized out of nowhere, casting a long shadow over them. Red froze, her heart pounding in her chest, her eyes locked on the ship, the one that was headed straight for them. And she knew with chilling certainty that it was too late to run, too late to hide. The Empire had come for them too, and there was nothing she could do to stop them. But what the Empire didn't know was that they had made one mistake. They had no idea who Red Carter was. Red's mind raced as the ship descended. The metallic thrum of its engines reverberated through the ground beneath her feet, the towering figure of the ship blocking out the sky as it hovered just above them. The soldiers had already started moving quickly, forming a perimeter around the area, their black armor gleaming under the harsh light of the ship's searchlights. Red's heart beat louder in her ears. Her hand tightened around Evie's small fingers, pulling her closer as she scanned the surrounding chaos. There had to be a way out, but every path seemed blocked, every escape route sealed by the relentless swarm of soldiers. Evie looked up at her, confused, her wide eyes searching for an explanation, but Red didn't have the words for her. She had no time to explain. She just had to act fast and get them both out of there. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. It wasn't just her life on the line anymore. It was Evie's too, and Red wasn't about to let anything happen to her daughter. The soldiers were too close now. She could hear their boots hitting the ground, their movements deliberate as they swept the area, looking for survivors, looking for those who might resist. Red had never been one to run from danger. She had always faced it head-on. But this was different. This wasn't some skirmish on the fringe of the galaxy. This was her home. This was her daughter. And if she didn't act now, they'd both be lost forever. A plan began to form in her mind. She knew the terrain around them well enough to use it to her advantage, the alleyways, the narrow streets, the hidden passageways. She had studied the city for years, mapping out every corner, every shortcut, every place a person could hide if they needed to disappear. Red had always been good at disappearing. Now she was going to have to put those skills to use. She crouched low to the ground, pulling Evie into a crouch beside her, moving swiftly as the soldiers drew nearer. They hadn't noticed them yet. But that wouldn't last for long. Red moved with precision, her every motion calculated and deliberate. She ducked into an alley, pulling Evie along with her, staying out of sight as the soldiers passed just feet away from them, the sound of their footsteps fading as they continued their search. Once they were safely out of sight, Red didn't stop. She couldn't afford to waste time. Every second counted. She needed to get to the safe house, the one place she knew she could hide for a while and regroup. But that was far away, and there were no guarantees that the soldiers wouldn't find them before they got there. Her grit on Evie tightened as they moved faster down the winding alleyways, her mind focused entirely on the task at hand. She was no longer just a mother trying to protect her daughter. She was a hunted woman on the run with no one to trust and no way to know who would be next to betray her. As they turned a corner, Red froze. She heard the unmistakable hum of the ship's engines in the distance, getting louder with every passing moment. They were getting closer. They hadn't given up on their search. Not yet. Red knew it was only a matter of time before they found them, unless she did something drastic, something they wouldn't expect. The plan was dangerous, but it was the only chance they had. Red let go of Evie's hand for a brief moment, pulling out a small device from the pocket of her jacket. She activated it, sending a signal that would trigger a distraction, a massive explosion that would throw the Empire's forces into chaos, long enough for her to get Evie to safety. But as she prepared to set the plan into motion, something changed. She felt it in her bones, the presence of a hunter. Someone or something was tracking them with a level of precision that could only belong to one of the Empire's elite squads. Red's blood ran cold. They weren't just after her anymore. They were after both of them. Red didn't hesitate. She pulled Evie deeper into the alleyway, her instincts screaming at her to move faster. Every second counted. Now the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end as the sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing off the narrow walls. The Empire's elite hunters were closer than she had ever felt before. Red's breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding in her chest. They were too good. They didn't make mistakes. They were designed to track and eliminate. And they were closing in on her now. She knew she couldn't outrun them. She couldn't hide from them much longer. They would find them eventually, and when they did, there would be no escape, no mercy. Red turned to Evie, her face hardening as she knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes. A little girl's expression was filled with fear, but there was something else there too, something Red recognized. It was trust, a quiet understanding that her mother would protect her no matter what, and that was enough to fuel Red's determination. She had never failed a mission in her life, and she wasn't about to start now. "We need to move quickly," Red whispered to Evie, her voice low and urgent. "They'll be on us any minute now. Keep close to me. Don't make a sound, understand?" Evie nodded, her wide eyes filling with resolve, and Red knew there was no turning back. They were in this together. She grabbed Evie's hand again and pulled her into motion. They darted through the alleyway with speed and precision, staying in the shadows, keeping out of sight of the hunters who were closing in. Red could feel their presence drawing nearer. It was as if they were already inside her head, anticipating every move before she made it. Red knew she had to buy them time to get to the next part of the plan. The explosion device was still in her pocket, but she couldn't activate it yet. Not until they were in position. She needed to get them to the old storage tunnels beneath the city, a place a few knew about, a place that even the Empire's hunters wouldn't think to look. But it was far, and the clock was ticking. As they moved through the darkened streets, Red's mind raced. She couldn't afford to be caught. She had trained for this. She had fought and survived battles on distant worlds. But none of it mattered now. None of it compared to the danger she felt in this moment. This wasn't just about survival. It was about her daughter. It was about protecting Evie at all costs. The Empire had taken everything from her, and now they were going to take the last thing she had left. Red would not let that happen. She reached the entrance to the tunnels and paused for just a second, scanning the area for any signs of movement. She could hear the faint hum of the hunter's sensors sweeping over the streets. The hairs on her neck prickled, and she knew they were too close to risk going down into the tunnels without a fight. "Hold on," Red whispered to Evie. "Keep still, they can't see us yet." Evie's small hand gripped Red's tightly as they crouched against the cold stone wall of the tunnel entrance. Red's pulse raced. She couldn't afford to make a single mistake. One wrong move, and they'd be trapped. But as the footsteps grew louder and the hunters closed in on their position, Red's mind locked into focus. She was going to make them regret ever coming to Earth. She was going to give them a fight they'd never forget. The moment the first hunter stepped into view, Red didn't hesitate. She reached into her jacket, pulling out the device. With a swift motion, she activated it, and immediately a deafening explosion rocked the city's foundation. The shockwave knocked the hunters off their feet and threw debris into the air, giving Red the split second she needed to drag Evie into the tunnels. She didn't look back, not even for a second, knowing they were already on the move again. They were in the tunnels now, and there was no turning back. The Empire had made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated her. Red and Evie moved quickly through the dark tunnels, their footsteps echoing off the stone walls as they ran deeper into the underground labyrinth. Red's mind raced, her senses hyper-alert. Every sound, every flicker of light was a threat. The hunters had been momentarily thrown off by the explosion, but she knew they would regroup quickly and come after them with everything they had. Red didn't have time to waste. She had to keep them moving. She had to stay one step ahead if they were going to make it out alive. Evie was silent beside her, gripping her hand tightly, but Red could feel the tension in her small fingers, the fear in her little body. But Red couldn't stop, not for a second, not even for Evie. She had to keep going, had to stay strong for both of them. The tunnels were familiar to Red. She had used them before for training purposes long ago. But now they felt different. They felt like a maze, a prison, built to trap her. She could hear the distant hum of the Empire's drones above them, scanning the streets, searching for any signs of life. But Red knew the tunnels well enough to avoid the drones. They wouldn't be able to follow them down here, at least not easily. But the hunters would come. They always came. Red's breath was steady, her mind was calm, but underneath the calm, there was a cold fury building. It was a fury that had been growing since the moment the Empire had stolen Evie from her home. It was a fury that had burned in her heart ever since she had been forced to leave her planet and fight in wars she didn't choose. It was the same fury that had kept her alive when others had fallen, and now it was the only thing keeping her moving. She glanced down at Evie, who was looking up at her with wide eyes, her face a mix of confusion and fear. Red smiled softly and squeezed her hand, but inside she was a storm. She couldn't allow herself to show weakness, not now, not when they were so close to being safe. They reached a fork in the tunnels, and Red paused, her senses on high alert. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the hairs on her neck standing up. As she listened for any sign of movement above them, she heard nothing but silence for a moment. But it was the kind of silence that made her uneasy, the kind that meant the enemy was waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They can't be too far behind. Red thought they're coming. Evie tugged at her hand. "Mom, where are we going?" Red didn't answer right away. She was still calculating the best route to take. She could head to the underground resistance hideout, but that was too risky. The Empire would be able to track them. She needed somewhere more secure, somewhere the hunters wouldn't think to look. Red's eyes flickered to a small hatch at the far end of the tunnel. It was hidden behind a stack of debris, but Red knew it led to a forgotten part of the city, a place even the Empire wouldn't bother with. It was old and abandoned, but it would be the perfect place to lay low until she could figure out their next move. She motioned to Evie, and the two of them crept toward the hatch. She pried it open with ease, the rusted metal groaning in protest, but it held as she lifted it just enough for them to slip through. Red led Evie down into the narrow passageway below them. The air was damp and cold, but it was safer here, safer than anywhere else. They could be hidden from the Empire's prying eyes, at least for a while. As they made their way down the dark corridor, Red couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She had felt it before, a sense that something was stalking them, just out of sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And she wasn't about to let that happen again, not on her watch. She glanced down at Evie, who was looking up at her with trust in her eyes, and Red's heart clenched. But she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. The storm was coming, and she needed to be ready. Red kept moving through the darkness, every step calculated, every sense on high alert. As they made their way deeper into the forgotten corridors beneath the city, the air grew colder and the silence thicker. The distant hum of the Empire's drones above them was almost inaudible now. But Red knew better than to let her guard down. It was only a matter of time before the Empire would find them down here, and when they did, she would make them regret it. Evie was still holding her hand, her small fingers trembling, but she didn't make a sound. Red could feel her daughter's fear, but she couldn't afford to show any weakness, not now, not when everything was on the line. She needed to stay calm, to be the protector, the shield Evie needed. Red scanned the tunnel ahead of them. The dim light from their small flashlight flickered against the walls, revealing old brickwork and rusted metal. She knew this part of the city well. It was a place she had used for training a long time ago, a place so far from the Empire's reach that even they had forgotten about it. But that was before the Empire had come to Earth, before they had set their sights on the planet, and now she wasn't sure if this place was as safe as she remembered. "Mom, where are we going?" Evie's voice was small and tentative, but it carried a weight Red hadn't expected. She crouched down to her daughter's level, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "We're going to be okay," Red whispered. "We just have to keep moving, and we'll find a place to hide, but we can't stop, not yet." Evie nodded silently, her eyes wide, but trusting. Red knew her daughter was scared, but she also knew that Evie understood the urgency of their situation. Red had raised her to be strong, to face the world without fear, even in the darkest times, and it was that strength that would get them through this. They continued down the passageway, moving quickly, but quietly. As the seconds dragged on, Red's mind raced, her thoughts constantly shifting between the present and the future. The explosion from earlier had bought them some time, but she knew that time was running out. The Empire wouldn't stop. They would never stop until they had captured her and Evie, and she couldn't let that happen. They had to make it out of the city. They had to make it to safety. Red felt her pulse quicken when she heard something, the faintest sound, like footsteps echoing through the tunnel. Her heart skipped a beat, and her hand tightened around Evie's. She motioned for her to be silent, and they both froze in place. Red's mind went into overdrive. She tried to estimate the distance to the sound, but it was hard to tell. The tunnel was too narrow, too winding. She couldn't be sure if it was the Empire's soldiers or just her nerves playing tricks on her. Evie looked up at her, eyes wide with fear. Red placed a finger to her lips, signaling for her to stay quiet. Then she crouched down, taking one last look around her. They were trapped. There was nowhere to go, no way to escape, unless she made a choice that would put them both at risk. Red felt her muscles tense. Every instinct in her screamed to move, to find the nearest exit. But there was no time. She knew the Empire's elite hunters could be closing in on them. At that very moment, their specialized sensors would easily pick up on their presence. They couldn't outrun them down here, not in these tunnels. Red glanced around quickly and saw an old maintenance hatch tucked into the wall just ahead. It was barely visible in the dim light, but she knew it was their only chance. She grabbed Evie's hand and pulled her toward it with urgency. She pushed the hatch open with all her strength and ushered Evie through first, before following behind her. She slammed the hatch shut just as the echo of footsteps grew louder. They were close, too close. Red's breath came in short gasps as she pulled Evie through the cramped maintenance tunnel. It was barely wide enough for them to move, but it was the only way out. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest. The hunters were getting closer. She could hear their movements now clearer than before. They were hunting them down. They weren't going to let them escape. "We have to go faster," Red urged quietly, but firmly, her voice barely above a whisper. They were running out of time. They couldn't afford to let the hunters find them. Not now, not after everything they had already been through. The maintenance tunnel stretched out before them, dark and narrow. Red's heart pounded in her chest as she urged Evie to keep moving. Her footsteps echoed in the cramped space, but she could hear the sounds of the hunters growing nearer every second, the soft hum of their scanners, picking up faint signals, their presence unmistakable. Red knew they didn't have much time left. The hatch had bought them a few moments, but it wouldn't hold them off forever. She could already feel the weight of their approach closing in on them, and she had no intention of letting them catch her or Evie, not now, not ever. Evie's breath was shallow, her small feet stumbling as they raced down the tunnel. Red kept her grip tight on her hand, pulling her forward with each step. She could hear the soft scrape of Evie's shoes against the floor, but she couldn't stop to check on her daughter, not now. She had to keep moving. Every second counted. Every second was another chance for them to get away. "We're almost there," Red whispered, urging Evie to pick up her pace, but the sound of footsteps behind them intensified. They weren't far behind the hunters, but closing in. They had to know by now that Red and Evie had escaped down the maintenance shaft. They had to have tracked them here already. Red could feel the panic rising in her chest, but she shoved it down, focusing on the task at hand. Ahead of them, the tunnel forked, splitting into two paths. Red glanced at both of them quickly. The left one looked narrower and seemed to go deeper into the city's forgotten depths, while the right one curved upward toward an old service entrance that might lead them outside of the city. Red didn't hesitate. She grabbed Evie's arm and yanked her down the right path, trusting that it would lead them to a way out, a place where they could hide until the hunters gave up their pursuit. "Keep up, Evie," Red urged, her voice tight with urgency, her mind racing with possibilities. She couldn't afford to make a mistake here. There were no more options, no more backup. No one was coming to save them. This was it. This was all she had left. They ran down the tunnel, the air growing colder and thicker with each step, their footsteps quickening. As they neared the service entrance, the sound of the hunters' footsteps still trailing behind them. They were too close now. Red could hear their heavy boots thumping against the ground, their breath echoing in the silence, and she knew they were nearly at the exit when she saw the light ahead of them, the faint glow from the cracked door leading outside the city. Red reached the door first and shoved against it with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. The rusted metal groaned under her force, and she cursed under her breath. The hunters were almost there. They could hear them now, their voices growing louder, their commands sharp and demanding. But Red didn't stop. She slammed her shoulder against the door again. This time the metal gave with a screech, and the door swung open just enough for her to squeeze through. She pulled Evie in after her, and they both tumbled into the darkness outside. They were free for the moment, but Red knew the Empire would never stop hunting them. She could already hear the engines of the warships overhead, their searchlights sweeping across the city as they searched for any signs of life. Red didn't dare look back. She just pulled Evie into the shadows and kept moving through the abandoned streets, trying to stay low, trying to stay out of sight. The city had become a battlefield overnight, and now it was a war zone. She was no longer just fighting for survival. She was fighting to protect Evie, to keep her safe from the Empire's grasp. Red could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on her, but she would bear it. She would do whatever it took to keep her daughter alive. They had to find shelter, and they had to find it fast. Red had no intention of stopping until they were 1,000,000 miles away from the Empire's reach. But she knew that wasn't going to happen anytime soon. The hunt had just begun, and this time the hunters had no idea who they were chasing. The streets were eerily quiet as Red and Evie moved through the shadows. The distant sound of the Empire's warships above was a constant reminder of how close the danger was. The city was no longer the place Red had known. It was now a war zone, a place where the rules of survival had been rewritten. She kept her eyes on the path ahead her, every step deliberate and careful as they moved between abandoned buildings and through alleyways, trying to stay out of sight. But every turn felt like it could be their last, every shadow a potential threat. Evie clung to Red's side, her small body trembling from the fear that radiated off of her. But Red didn't slow down. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not now. They had barely escaped the maintenance tunnels. And even though they were free for the moment, Red knew it wouldn't last long. The Empire's hunters were relentless. They wouldn't stop until they found them, and Red wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running. They reached an old building that had been abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up, and the doors hung loosely on their hinges. But it was a place to hide for now. Red pulled Evie inside the dark interior, and they ducked low behind a crumbling wall that had once been part of the building's foundation. The air inside was thick with dust and the smell of mildew, but it was shelter, and that's all Red could afford right now. "Stay here," Red whispered to Evie as she knelt down beside her and wrapped her arms around her protectively. "We need to stay hidden for a while. We can't risk being seen." Evie nodded silently, her wide eyes filled with trust and fear. Red kissed the top of her head and stood up, moving to the cracked window to peek outside. She knew they couldn't stay here long, but for the moment, it was the only place they could hide. Red squinted through the grime-covered window, trying to make out any movement in the streets beyond, but everything seemed still for now. The Empire's forces were everywhere, but they hadn't found their hiding spot yet. Red allowed herself a brief moment of relief, but she knew it wouldn't last. They were still being hunted, they were still a target, and until she could figure out their next move, they would remain on the run. Her mind raced as she considered their options. They couldn't stay in the city forever, and they couldn't trust anyone, not while the Empire was in control. Red needed to get Evie out of here, but the question was where to go, how to escape the Empire's reach without leading them straight to another trap. She turned away from the window and crouched down beside Evie, who was huddled against the wall, eyes wide with worry. Red reached out to gently touch her daughter's face and smiled reassuringly. "We'll be okay," she said, even though she didn't entirely believe it herself. But she had to say it. Evie needed to hear it. She needed to feel safe in a world that had turned upside down. Red thought of the underground resistance she had worked with years ago, before she had settled down to live a quieter life. They were scattered now, but she knew they had safe houses hidden across the planet. If she could just make contact with them, if she could find one of those outposts, then maybe they could regroup and come up with a plan to strike back against the Empire. But even that plan felt dangerous and uncertain. Red couldn't afford to take risks that might endanger Evie any more than she already had. She had to think of a way to get them off-world to somewhere safe, but every option seemed out of reach, every path fraught with danger. The warships would be waiting for them in orbit, and the Empire's forces would be patrolling every exit. The sound of something shifting in the distance caught Red's attention. Her head snapped up, her heart skipped a beat. She held her breath, waiting for any sign of movement from outside the building. She hadn't heard the footsteps before, but now they were unmistakable, heavy boots scraping the pavement, the familiar hum of the Empire's drones buzzing overhead. Red's blood ran cold. They were close, too close to let their guard down. She quickly grabbed Evie and pulled her further into the shadows of the building, pressing them both against the wall as quietly as possible. Every muscle in her body tensed, ready to react at a moment's notice. Red's mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. She couldn't let them find her and Evie, not now, not when they were so close to escaping. But the hunters were out there, and Red had no illusions about the danger they posed this time. The stakes were higher than ever before. Red's heart pounded in her chest as she pressed her back against the cold stone wall of the abandoned building, her breath barely audible. She could feel Evie's small body trembling beside her, the girl's face pressed against her side, silent with fear. Red had always been the one to protect others, to lead others to safety, but now with her daughter's life on the line, she was uncertain. She had to fight for them both now, and she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep running from the Empire's relentless pursuit. The footsteps grew louder with every passing second. Red's pulse quickened, but she remained still, her eyes scanning the cracks in the board of that window, trying to make out any movement outside the building. Her breath hitched when she saw a shadow move past the window. It wasn't just one soldier, but several. Their footsteps cinched together as they made their way down the street outside. Red's body tensed, ready to react, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to panic, not now. She had to wait for the right moment. Evie clutched her hand tightly. Red could feel the girl's small fingers digging into her skin, but she didn't dare move, not yet. If they were discovered now, it would all be over. She glanced down at Evie and smiled softly, though her heart was heavy with worry. They were both terrified, but they had made it this far, and Red wasn't about to let them fall short now. She was going to find a way to get them out of this alive. The soldiers outside continued to search the streets, moving slowly and deliberately, as if they already knew someone was hiding in the area. Red's mind raced trying to come up with a plan. She could feel the time slipping away each second, bringing them closer to discovery. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't afford to be found by them. But she couldn't keep hiding forever. Either the city was closing in on them, and if she didn't act soon, they would be trapped. She moved closer to Evie, lowering her voice to a whisper, "We need to move now." Evie's wide eyes searched her face, and without hesitation the girl nodded quietly. Red knew it was time. She had to take the risk. If they stayed here much longer, they would be cornered. So she grabbed Evie's hand and led her silently through the building. They had to find another exit, another way out, before the hunters got too close. They crept through the darkness, moving like shadows between the decaying walls, avoiding the creaks and groans of the floorboards beneath them. Red's every instinct screamed at her to hurry, but she knew they had to be quiet. No noise, no sign that they were here. They couldn't alert the hunters to their position, or everything would be over in an instant. As they neared the back of the building, Red paused and peered around the corner of the room, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the area outside. Through a small crack in the wall, she could see the soldiers passing by just beyond the alleyway. Red's chest tightened as she considered their options. There was no way to get past them without being seen. The only way out was through the back exit, and it was a long shot, but it was their best chance. Red motioned to Evie, and they moved as quickly as possible down the narrow hallway to the back door. She could hear the soldiers' voices, now their words indistinct, but their presence unmistakable. They were getting closer. Red reached the door and hesitated for just a moment. She had to make sure it was clear outside before they stepped into the open world beyond. A soft breeze wafted through the crack under the door, carrying the scent of rain and the faint hum of distant engines. Red knew the Empire was still out there, their warships patrolling the skies, their ground forces sweeping the city. She had to move fast, and she had to be quiet. With a deep breath, Red slowly opened the door just enough for them to slip through the gap. She held her breath as they stepped into the alleyway, the cold air biting at their skin. She pulled Evie close to her body, and they crept along the wall, staying as low as possible. Red's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement in the streets beyond them, but all was still for now. They had made it out of the building, but the hard part was far from over. Red knew they weren't safe, yet the hunters could still be anywhere, and they had no idea where to go next. All she knew was they couldn't stay in the city much longer. They had to keep moving, keep searching for a way to get off the planet before it was too late. But even that felt like a distant dream, a hope that was fading with each passing moment as the Empire's grip tightened around them. The alleyway stretched before them, dark and narrow. Red's heart raced as she led Evie through the shadows, every instinct screaming at her to keep moving, to keep putting distance between them and the Empire. But the streets were unfamiliar. Now the city had become a maze, a dangerous labyrinth, filled with hidden threats at every turn. The once safe places now felt like death traps, and every corner could hide an enemy. Evie was still close beside her, her small body trembling with each step, but Red could feel the girl's determination, the same fierce will to survive that burned within her. Red didn't dare stop to check the girl's face. Though she could sense her anxiety, she kept her focus forward, eyes darting from side to side, watching for any sign of movement above. The hum of the warships still resonated in the air, a constant reminder that the Empire was never far behind. They reached a dead end in the alley, and Red cursed under her breath. They were trapped, but she wasn't going to give up, not now. Not when they were so close to escaping. She scanned the wall ahead of them for any sign of an exit. There was nothing but old brick, and iron, a wall as unforgiving as the city itself. But then she spotted something, a small grate near the ground covered by rust, but barely held in place. Red didn't hesitate. She knelt down and tugged at the grate with all her strength. It creaked, but held fast. Her breath quickened as she strained to open it. She had to get through it. She had to. "Come on," Red muttered to herself as she gave the grate another hard pull. This time it shifted just enough for her to slide her fingers under the edge, and with one final tug it came loose. She quickly moved it aside and motioned for Evie to crawl through first. Evie hesitated for a moment, but then looked up at her mother with wide eyes, filled with trust. She didn't question, she simply obeyed, and crawled through the small opening. Red followed right behind her, making sure to keep her movements as quiet as possible. They slipped into a narrow maintenance tunnel that led deeper into the city's underbelly. It was cold and dark, but for the first time in what felt like forever, it felt safe. The oppressive hum of the Empire's searchlights was muffled here, and for a brief moment Red allowed herself to exhale. They were still alive, they had made it this far, but the battle wasn't over yet. Red knew the Empire would never stop hunting them, and she wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running. Her body ached from the constant movement and the weight of the burden she carried. But she couldn't afford to slow down, not for a second, not when Evie was depending on her to lead them to safety. The tunnel twisted ahead, and Red led them down a path that seemed to go on forever. They passed old machinery and rusted pipes. In the silence of the underground, the air thick with the scent of decay, Red's thoughts raced. She knew they couldn't stay here long. But she didn't have a plan. She didn't know where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. They couldn't go back to the surface. The Empire would be waiting for them. There they needed to find a way off this planet, somewhere far beyond the Empire's reach. But even that seemed like a dream, a distant hope that Red couldn't afford to rely on. As they moved deeper into the tunnel, Red noticed something strange ahead. A faint light flickered in the distance. She squinted her eyes, adjusting to the dimness, and saw a faint outline of what appeared to be a door, but the markings on it were unfamiliar. Red hesitated. She didn't trust anything anymore. But this might be their way out, a hidden passage, a place the Empire had forgotten about. She could only hope that it was their salvation. They reached the door, and Red pressed her ear against it, listening for any signs of movement. When she heard nothing, she slowly turned the handle and pushed it open with a creak. They stepped into another chamber, this one larger and more open than the tunnels they had just been through. But it was also eerily quiet, too quiet. Red's heart raced as she scanned the space. And then she saw it in the far corner, a ship waiting to take them away. It was old and battered, but it was a ship. It was their escape. Red's breath caught in her throat as she realized what they had found, a hidden outpost of the Resistance, long abandoned, but still intact. And for the first time in days, Red allowed herself to believe that they had made it out alive. They had a chance to survive, to fight back against the Empire. But even as she breathed a sigh of relief, she knew this was only the beginning. The war had only just begun, and now they were ready to fight back.